The villagers of Umuoma couldn't stop talking about Chíké. He was the son of a respected farmer, but his name had become a stain on the family's honor. "Did you hear?" Mama Nkechi's voice trembled as she relayed the news by the village well. Chíké sold his father's farm to pay his gambling debt. Gasps, murmurs, eyes darting in disbelief. The farm wasn't just land. It was the soul of their family, passed down through generations. The red soil of Umuoma had fed not just Chíké's family, but the community. To think it was gone. And for what? Chíké had a secret life, one that thrived under the glow of kerosene lamps and the roll of dice. The small smoky room where he played okwe felt like a different world. The clinking of coins, the laughter of men drunk on palm wine, and the occasional thud of a losing hand created a rhythm that Chíké couldn't resist. He'd often sneak out into the night, his shadow disappearing into the narrow, moonlit paths of Umuoma. "Ah, Chíké, you're here again," one of the gamblers teased, slapping him on the back as he entered. His charm made him a favorite among the players. He laughed easily, joked often, and always seemed to have a way with words. But charm didn't pay debts, and luck wasn't always kind. That night, the air felt heavier, the stakes higher. Chíké threw the dice with a confidence he didn't feel. Each roll seemed to take an eternity, the dice bouncing across the wooden table before finally stopping. Gasps, cheers, and groans filled the room as the game unfolded. Chíké's heart sank with each loss, his pile of coins dwindling until it was gone. "Chíké," a low voice growled. The room went silent as Agu, the debt collector, stepped forward. His broad shoulders and scarred face gave him an intimidating presence. He leaned in close, his breath hot and sour. "You owe me 3 days. If you don't pay, I'll take something precious." His voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a machete. Chíké's hands trembled as he left the gambling den. His thoughts raced. He had no money, no savings, and no one to turn to. As he paced the small room he shared with his younger siblings, his eyes fell on a folded piece of paper tucked under a clay pot. The deed to his father's farm. His breath quickened and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. Could he? No, he shook his head, but the weight of Agu's threat pressed down on him, suffocating and unrelenting. The farm, the soil that had nurtured their family for generations, was his only option. It wasn't an easy choice. The farm meant everything to his father, Okonkwo, a man who had spent his life coaxing yams from the stubborn earth, his hands roughened by years of labor. Chíké sat in the dim room, the single lantern casting long shadows on the mud walls. He clenched and unclenched his fists, his heart pounding like a drum. "I'll buy it back," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the silence of the night. "It's just temporary." The next morning, Chíké walked through the village with the deed tucked under his arm. The early sun bathed everything in a golden hue, but it did little to warm the chill in his chest. When he arrived at Agu's house, the man was already waiting. Agu's sharp eyes scanned Chíké as if sizing him up. "You brought it?" Agu asked, his voice low and grating, like the scrape of metal against stone. Chíké nodded, his throat too dry to speak. With trembling hands, he unfolded the deed and passed it to Agu. The man grinned, revealing yellowed teeth that seemed to glow in the sunlight. "Smart boy," he said, his tone oily and mocking. Chíké couldn't ignore the way Agu's fingers lingered on the paper, as though savoring his victory. There was something chilling in the way he spoke, a finality that made Chíké's stomach churn. When Chíké returned home, Okonkwo was sitting on the veranda. His father's strong, weathered frame looked smaller, as if the weight of life had finally bent him. He stared out at the horizon, his gaze fixed and distant. The silence was unbearable. "Papa," Chíké began, his voice cracking. Okonkwo didn't respond. He didn't even glance his way. Instead, he remained still, his hands resting on his knees, his jaw clenched as though holding back words too heavy to release. The sun sank lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red. The air grew cooler, but Chíké felt no relief. Each passing moment stretched endlessly, the silence between father and son louder than any words could have been. Okonkwo's stillness was a reprimand, a sorrow deeper than any scolding could convey. The news spread quickly. At the market, by the stream, even in the dim glow of evening fires, people whispered about Chíké. How could he? To his own father? Mama Nkechi shook her head, her voice carrying a mix of disbelief and anger. I never thought Chíké would sink so low, a young man muttered. His words met with murmurs of agreement. Even Chíké's childhood friends avoided him. Once his closest allies, they now crossed the road when they saw him coming. Children who used to greet him with smiles now hid behind their mothers' wrappers. Chíké had become a pariah, the weight of his guilt pressing on him like a heavy stone. But even with the shame, a small part of him clung to hope. He dreamed of a way out, a way to undo the damage he had caused. Meanwhile, Ise, the wealthy trader who bought the land, wasted no time. The sound of bulldozers echoed through the village, tearing apart the rich red soil that had once been a symbol of life and abundance. The air filled with the choking smell of diesel, mixing with the dust that rose in thick clouds. Villagers gathered at a distance, their faces etched with shock and sorrow. They watched in silence as the lush farm, with its yam mounds and banana trees, was reduced to a barren, lifeless construction site. What is he building? Someone whispered, though no one had the courage to ask Ise directly. But as the days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen. The village well, which had always overflowed even in the dry season, started to dry up. Women struggled to fill their clay pots, their worried murmurs growing louder each day. This has never happened before, one of the elders said, his brows furrowed deeply. It's the land, another elder muttered, his voice low. Its spirit has been disturbed. Crops on nearby farms began to wither, their once green leaves turning brittle and brown. The air felt heavier, the kind of weight that made every breath seem harder. People began to speak in hushed tones, afraid of what might come next. And yet, the construction continued, the growl of machines a constant reminder of what had been lost. The storm came out of nowhere, a sudden fury that painted the sky black and roared with thunder. Trees bent under the violent winds, their branches clawing at the air. Lightning lit up the old Iroko tree at the edge of the farm, its gnarled silhouette momentarily illuminated before a deafening crack split the air. The tree smoldered, its trunk blackened by the strike, as rain pounded the ground mercilessly. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a heavy stillness in its wake. But the villagers whispered about what had happened. Ise's workers, pale and shaken, gathered at the edge of the farm. I heard whispers, one said, his voice trembling. It was like voices in the wind. Another nodded, his eyes darting to the shadows under the smoldering tree. I saw something, a figure, watching us. None of them would return to the site. Chíké, meanwhile, was haunted in his own way. He sat alone in the small, dim room that now felt like a prison. The nights brought no peace. In his dreams, his father's voice echoed deep and resonant, filled with sorrow and warning. The land remembers, Chíké. The land remembers. Each time he woke, his heart pounded as though he'd been running. The words clung to him like a shadow, growing heavier with every passing day. Desperate, Chíké visited the village priest, Dyke. The priest's compound was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling palm fronds and the distant crow of a rooster. Dyke sat on a low wooden stool, his wrinkled face illuminated by the flickering glow of an oil lamp. He looked at Chíké for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes filled with something between pity and sternness. "The land is angry," Dyke said finally, his voice heavy with meaning. "You must make amends." Chíké's throat tightened. He hesitated, then asked, "How?" His voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Dyke rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He walked over to a shelf lined with jars, pots, and calabashes of various sizes. He selected a small calabash filled with white chalk and held it out to Chíké. "Take this," he said, his tone firm. "Go to the farm. Speak from your heart. Apologize to the spirits. Offer a sacrifice. Only then can the balance be restored." Chíké reached out with unsteady hands, taking the calabash as if it weighed a ton. Will it work?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt and fear. Dyke fixed him with a piercing stare. "The spirits listen, but they are not easily swayed. It is not just words they seek, but true remorse. Go now, before it is too late." That night, under the light of a full moon, Chíké stood in the middle of the barren land, the calabash of chalk trembling in his hands. The once fertile soil stretched out around him, cracked and lifeless under the pale glow of the moon. Shadows danced eerily across the ground as the wind whispered through the empty fields. He knelt slowly, his knees pressing into the dry earth, and poured the chalk in a deliberate, trembling line. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't mean for this to happen. Please, forgive me." The wind picked up suddenly, swirling around him with a force that sent chills down his spine. It carried his words away, but the oppressive stillness that followed seemed to press down on him, heavier than before. Not the soothing quiet of night, but a silence thick with expectation, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Chíké remained on his knees, his hands clenching the empty calabash, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of his actions seemed to sink deeper into him, and he felt small against the vastness of the sky above and the earth below. "Please," he murmured again, his voice barely audible against the stillness. The next morning, Chíké woke to the sound of rain pattering against the thatched roof of his home. It was a soft, rhythmic sound that felt almost foreign after so many dry weeks. He rushed outside, his bare feet splashing into the muddy ground. The air smelled fresh, cleansed by the downpour, and the village well was brimming with water, its surface rippling under the falling drops. He stood in awe as he saw the crops on neighboring farms, wilted and brown just a day before, standing taller, their leaves glistening with renewed life. The villagers emerged from their homes, their faces etched with wonder and cautious hope. Chíké caught sight of Mama Nkechi by the well, her weathered hands gripping a clay pot. She glanced at him, her gaze lingering. "The rain has returned," she said softly, her tone guarded but not unkind. Slowly, others began to nod and murmur, their eyes meeting his with tentative acceptance. The weight in Chíké's chest eased just slightly. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, the villagers' chatter included him again, and it gave him a fragile sense of belonging he hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. Chíké worked tirelessly, day and night, to earn back the money to repurchase the farm. His hands bore fresh calluses, and his back ached from countless hours spent laboring under the unforgiving sun. The weight of his mistake spurred him on, driving him to push through exhaustion and despair. When the day finally came, Chíké stood at the entrance of his father's hut, clutching the deed tightly in his trembling hands. The sun cast a warm glow across the yard, but his nerves made the air feel heavy. Okonkwo sat on a low stool, peeling yams with slow, deliberate movements. He looked up as Chíké approached, his weathered face unreadable. "Papa," Chíké began, his voice faltering. He swallowed hard and held out the paper. This belongs to you again." For a moment, Okonkwo said nothing, his eyes scanning the deed as though verifying its authenticity. Then his hand shook slightly as he took it. His gaze softened, and tears welled up in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The simple words carried a weight that made Chíké's chest tighten with both relief and gratitude. The farm, once barren and silent, soon buzzed with life again. Green shoots began to sprout from the red soil, a testament to the labor of many hands working together. Villagers, once distant and mistrustful, joined forces to help restore what had been lost. Slowly but surely, the land healed, and so did the community. And Chíké, once lost in the shadows of his own mistakes, found his way back to the light. He stood in the middle of the fields one day, the wind carrying the scent of fresh earth and blooming crops. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to smile, a real, unburdened smile. The land remembers. It holds the stories of those who walk on it. Chíké's story became a cautionary tale, told by the fireside to remind everyone of the power of community, the consequences of selfishness, and the possibility of redemption.